All right, ready to go. So welcome and Felcha. This is Random Thoughts from County Antrim. And I'm your host, David McDonnell. And this is our podcast of January 31st, 2021. The last day of the month. Which actually is a reminder. I have yet to make my mortgage payment, and it's due tomorrow. And if my mortgage lender is listening to this podcast, I promise I will make the payment as soon as this podcast is over. Now, I do have to make a mortgage payment. I have not yet taken the advice of Tom Selleck and taken out a reverse mortgage. And I guess reverse mortgages are okay. And certainly Tom Selleck tells us that it's not a scheme to take away the home of a senior citizen. Although, unfortunately, that does happen from time to time. What Tom doesn't tell folks about is the wonders of compounding of interest. Compound interest is a wonderful thing if you're a saver, because your savings grows, your investment grows at a faster rate than what you would think based on the rate of return. And that's because what you've earned in interest in one period is added to the principal, and then you earn interest on that. And it's interest on interest that helps your investment grow. Now, the opposite is true with a reverse mortgage. If you don't make a mortgage payment, the unpaid interest is then added to the principal balance. And then interest accrues on that number. And when you don't make the next payment, interest accrues on that number. Your debt is compounding. You're getting interest is accruing on the interest. And it makes that number grow. It makes your debt grow at a fairly quick rate. So I have a more conventional type mortgage. And I guess, dealing with labeling, if it's not a reverse mortgage, if it's the opposite of a reverse mortgage, I guess you call my mortgage a forward mortgage. But I didn't intend to talk about reverse mortgages or forward mortgages today. That was just one of my random thoughts. Now, what I did want to talk about was an interesting true story. It takes place it's in Irish history. It takes place in the latter part of the 19th century. And it has elements of politics and economics. But it includes a man who's a central part of the story, and his last name since creeped into the English language as both a noun and a verb. And that story has resonance today, here in the 21st century. Now, first let me tell you the backstory. In the 16th, 17th century, virtually all the land in Ireland was confiscated from the Irish and became owned by English landlords. The entire island was owned by 1,000 or so families. And the Irish became tenants on their own island. And the rural Irish were kind of pushed into smaller and smaller parcels of land. And the only crop they could grow on those small parcels in sufficient quantity, sufficient yield to feed their family was the potato. Which is why the Irish became so potato dependent. Now, Ireland still produced an array of other crops, wheat and barley and oats. And they grew livestock, cattle, sheep, pigs. But these were large farming operations, and they were owned by the English landlords, and they were worked by Irish laborers. And these other agricultural products other than the potato, they were not for consumption by the Irish. They were for export. Because Ireland had a role to play in the British Empire, and that role was to feed the British Empire. So Irish food grown and raised in Ireland was sent to England, and it was sent to British soldiers all over the world, and it was sent to British colonials. Now, when the potato blight hit Ireland in 1845, and it continued to 1850, that was the period when a million and a half Irish died from starvation-related diseases. Now, during that period of time, Ireland continued to export food. Now, I've made that statement at various forums when I've talked to people, and I kind of look out to the audience when I'm talking, and I could see their eyes kind of glaze over, and I could see it didn't sink in. And so I repeated it. I repeated that statement. Now, I can't look into your eyes, but I suspect you may have the same reaction. So I'm going to repeat that statement again. When millions of people were starving in Ireland, Ireland produced food and exported that food out of Ireland. The problem was not that there wasn't food in Ireland. The problem was simply that the food produced in Ireland was not made available to the people in Ireland who were starving. Now, conditions didn't change much after 1850. Land was still owned by English landlords. There was a British study done, I think it was 1876, that almost all of Ireland was owned by 10,000 people. That's 0.2% of the population. And even that number is overstated because some of those were owners of relatively small parcels of land. The fact is that well over half of Ireland was owned by 750 of the richest landlords. And the rural Irish continued to live in poverty. They continued to be potato dependent. The potato blight continued to hit from time to time, years after the famine years. People continued to starve, and Ireland continued to export food. Now, we don't think of those years much in that context, and it's simply because there were far fewer Irish to suffer, because so many had died during the Hunger Years, and so many had left Ireland for America. There just was far fewer Irish left in Ireland to suffer. But it certainly was obvious to any objective observer that that system could not sustain itself any longer. And the situation did change, but it took 50, 60 more years. It wasn't until the very end of the 19th century and the early 20th century before that changed. And clearly the biggest need in Ireland at the time was for land reform. And the early push in Ireland in those days by reformers was for what they called the 3 F's. Fixing tenure was one of the F's. Fair rent and the right to freely sell your holdings. And note, all 3 of those were to preserve or to protect some rights of tenants. It wasn't for ownership of land. Transfer of ownership to the Irish of the rural lands didn't really occur to the very, very end of the 19th century and occurred much quicker during the 20th century. But let's go over those 3 F's real quick. One was fixing tenure. Now, the rural Irish were tenants, but they did not have a lease. They could stay on their land only as long as their landlord allowed it. And a tenant could be evicted for non-payment of rent, of course, but could be evicted for any reason or no reason at all. They were examples, particularly egregious examples, of a landlord deciding he wanted to use more land for his private hunting preserve, and he evicted all the tenants that were in the way of where he wanted to have his hunting preserve. And many more examples of landlords who have decided to expand their farming operation, and tenant farmers were in the way, so they were evicted. Now, tenure, some term to their lease, would just give tenants some security. And with that security, they could improve their land. They might improve the land or improve the hut that was on the land, with some comfort that they'd have some benefits to that improvement. The second F was fair rent. And it was intended to limit the atrocious rent paid by the rural Irish for the privilege of living in poverty. Now, the third F was freely sell. And here's the concept. It would allow a tenant to sell his leasehold interest to someone else and then thus recoup some of his investment. And the problem was this. If a tenant did anything to improve his little hovel, his hut, even putting a wood to cover the dirt floor, or doing something to make the hovel a bit larger for his extended family, or if he drained some bog land to make it a little more productive for raising a crop. By doing any of that, he would make his rented land more valuable. And what would a landlord do as a result of that? The landlord would raise his rent because now the land is more valuable. It didn't matter that it was the tenant who made it more valuable. Now, if the tenant could not pay the additional rent, the increased rent, he would be evicted. The landlord would find someone else to pay for the rent. And with that, there was absolutely no incentive for an Irish tenant to improve his home or improve his farm. In fact, there was a disincentive to do any of that. Now, these reforms in the late 19th century took a long time coming, but the efforts to do it was called the Land Wars. That was not a war in a traditional sense, just a series of actions. Some of them were organized, but many of them were just spontaneous. But frankly, what it was is the Irish who survived the famine and the generation after them, they were less fatalistic. They were less deferential to the landlords, and they were far more militant. And they just took actions, which again, step by step over 4 or 5 decades, finally resulted in some improvements. I'll give you some examples. The evictions continued during this time, but in the past, when there was an eviction, it was usually led by the landlord's agent. He brought with him a crew to throw out the belongings of the evicted tenant, and maybe even tear down the tenant's hut. And would usually bring along with him one constable, armed constable, to keep the peace in case there was trouble. But now, during this last part of the century, 19th century, the landlord often needed an entire squad of constables, and sometimes a squad of British soldiers, whenever he went on an eviction. And these evictions sometimes turn nasty, turn violent. I'll just tell you about one of those. It's called the Affray Belmullet. There's a small hamlet near Belmullet in County Mayo called Grawhill. There's only about a dozen homes in Grawhill at the time, one of the poorest regions in County Mayo. And a process server needed to go to Grawhill to serve a notice of eviction on a tenant. One process server, serving process on one tenant. He brought with him 60 constables. 60 constables, one process server. And as he went through Belmullet on his way to Grawhill, followed by his 60 constables, the villagers, people in Belmullet, saw this. And they followed them. And the crowd that was following the process server and the constable grew as they got to Grawhill. And by the time they got to Grawhill, there was 300 or so people in the crowd following the constables and the process server. And the crowd began throwing things at the constables, rocks, stones, whatever they could find. And the constables never did make it to Graw Hill. They gave up, turned around, started to head back, but they couldn't make their way through the crowd that had surrounded them. So the officer in charge ordered his men to fire. They were all armed, of course. And about 24 shots or so were fired. And there was one elderly woman who was killed. There were many, many more that were wounded. Many of the constables were injured from the flying objects. It's a miracle, actually, that more were killed. And the police later arrested many, many villagers from Belmullet. They charged them with an affray. Affray is an unlawful act of violence. But that's what happened, what started to happen when landlords tried to evict tenants. Now, there were some underground groups formed. Most notable of these were the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They later merged into, years later, decades later, merged in with the Irish Republican Army. But the Brotherhood did a lot of things to landlords to intimidate. There weren't a lot of these acts, but what they were pretty brutal. They burned barns, they killed livestock, sometimes they beat a landlord, sometimes they even assassinated the landlord. The British, of course, were outraged. They called these agrarian outrages. And then there was another group called the Land League, and they were organized to achieve some of these land reforms that I talked about. And they often called for rent strikes, particularly when Land League leaders were arrested, as they frequently were. But there were also often just spontaneous acts against landlords. And I saw this wonderful image. It was an illustration in The Graphic. It's a British weekly newspaper. I should say was a British weekly newspaper. It was an 1882 edition of The Graphic. It showed a British landlord on a fox hunt on his estate in Ireland. And it also showed Irish peasants along the pathway who were throwing rocks and other objects as the landlord as he passed by in his fox hunt. But I think that should give you an idea of the emotions and the tenor of the dispute that existed in the late 19th century. Now let me tell you about another series of events, also in County Mayo, and it introduced a novel form of protest. And it also introduced a new word into the English vocabulary. Now, there was a large farm in the area owned by an Englishman, Lord Erne. Now, Lord Erne owned well over 40,000 acres of land in Ireland. And this included about a 1,500-acre farm he owned in County Mayo. And his Mayo estate was run by an agent who was an English man who was a former British Army officer. And as was the practice on these estates, it was run by an English agent, owned by an English landlord, run by an English agent, and worked by local Irish laborers. Now, the Irish laborers didn't work on a salary, and they didn't work full-time. They were not regularly employed, but they were given work when it was needed. And so there were a lot of them working typically in the spring for the plantings. There were a lot of them that worked in the fall when it was harvest time, and far fewer the rest of the time of the year. And for all of this, they were paid a pittance, just a pittance. It was certainly not enough money to live on. Now, in the fall of 1880, there were activists in the area affiliated with the Land League, and they decided it was better to let these crops just rot rather than to harvest them for Lord Erne. And a local parish priest organized an effort to ostracize the agent. And the plan was that no one would have anything to do with him, and no one would harvest the crops. And if the agent came into town to do business, no one would do business with him. Local businesses just refused to serve him. If he went into the pub, any customers in the pub would leave, and the bartender would say, "Oh, we're closed," and shut the doors. The blacksmith in town wouldn't service the estate. The laundry service, the laundresses, wouldn't do any work for the estate. Even the postman would not deliver the mail to the estate. I don't know if there was a barber shop in town, but I'm sure if this agent went into the barber shop to get a haircut, the barber would have closed the doors and say, "Sorry, we're closed." Now, this made great news in England. Word didn't spread that much in Ireland, but it made a real ruckus in England. And newspapers in London sent correspondents to the area. And they were to document the victimization of this landlord's agent. This agent, in their eyes, was just doing his job as a servant of his lord. And he was being victimized. Now, the agent became emboldened by this. He hired, since no one would harvest his crop, he hired 50 men, mostly from Ulster, and brought them in to do the harvest. And the British government sent 1,000 constables to protect him. And in addition to the constables, they sent an entire regiment of British cavalry. I did some research. I tried to figure out how many cavalry, British soldiers, were there, and I couldn't find any good reference to it. But a typical cavalry regiment at the time was somewhere between 500 and 1,000 men. So think about that ratio. You had 1,000 constables, somewhere between 500 and another 1,000 British soldiers. Perhaps 2,000 soldiers and constables to protect the agent and his 50 workers. That's the ratio they needed to fight the ostracism and get this crop harvested. So when they brought him in, the priest called upon his people to ostracize the 50 workers, as well as the soldiers, and as well as the constables. Now, ostracize is a kind of a difficult word to understand. It's a difficult word to pronounce, particularly if you are from rural Mayo. The people in Mayo still spoke, their primary language was Irish, not English. And ostracize was a difficult concept and a difficult word for them to deal with. So the priest came up with another word. Now, the English agent to Lord Erne, his name was Charles Cunningham Boycott. So the priest told the locals to boycott the 50 workers, as well as the soldiers, as well as the constables. And boycott they did. They made life miserable for the workers and the soldiers and the constables. Now, the crops ultimately were saved, but at an incredible cost to the landlord and a ridiculously high cost to the British government. I saw one estimate about the whole affair that said Lord Erne's crops that were saved by harvesting that fall were worth about 500 pounds sterling, the British currency. And the cost to the British government for the constables and the soldiers was about 10,000 pounds. The British government spent 10,000 pounds to save Lord Erne 500 pounds. Now, Mr. Boycott, by the way, left for England right after the harvest and never returned to Ireland. But he will always be remembered. Mr. Boycott will always be remembered as the man who became a verb. Now, land reform came to Ireland, both in the rights for Irish tenants and ultimately ownership of the land. But again, as I said, it was a decades-long struggle. A boycott can be a very, very effective political weapon, an economic weapon. And I don't know if the boycott was invented in County Mayo. I've never seen references to that kind of protest, that kind of pressure in any earlier historical examples. If there are some, I apologize for not mentioning those. But subsequently, there are many examples. Mahatma Gandhi used it very effectively. He encouraged Indians to buy Indian products and to boycott British products, which caused tremendous economic damage to British, which imposed political pressure on the British. The other one that comes to my mind, is the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, which began after the arrest of Rosa Parks. She was arrested for not giving up her seat on a Montgomery bus, which local law required that if you were African American sitting in the back of the bus, you had to sit in the back of the bus. But if the front of the bus was for whites, and if the white seats were all full, the next white person that came in would sit at the next row that was reserved for coloreds. It was typically coloreds only behind there. But if the white section was full, someone in the next row had to get up and give up their seat to the next white passenger. And Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man and was arrested. And that led to a boycott of the Montgomery, Alabama bus system. It's a boycott that lasted for 381 days. I mean, it's over a year. During that time, African Americans in Montgomery walked to work. Maybe in several miles each way, but they walked to work rather than taking the bus. There were some black taxi drivers who would take people to work for 10 cents. That was the bus fare. They would take someone to work for 10 cents just so they wouldn't take the bus. But after 381 days, the city of Montgomery gave in, and the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama became fully integrated. Now, there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from history, and I think some of these are very pertinent today. I mean, when you think about it, there's an awful lot of nutbags out there. And I think for the rest of us, I think we simply have to do the right thing, which, nationally simply means getting this virus under control. Do whatever we can to create jobs, high-paying jobs, both for urban people and rural people, getting our healthcare delivery system improved, and telling the truth about many issues, including the fairness of our elections. But as to the nutbags, I think the best thing we can do is just ignore them. We can ostracize them. We can boycott them. Now, they will no doubt bitch and moan about the cancel culture. Nice label, cancel culture. I suppose if that phrase had existed, it would have been used by Lord Erne and Charles Boycott. Charles Boycott loved to paint himself as the victim in the whole thing, rather than the Irish laborers who were living in abject poverty. Now, I'm not trying to organize a national boycott or anything. It's just not what I do. But I will do my own boycott. It just makes sense. I mean, this moron senator from Missouri can write whatever books he wants, but I'm not going to buy one. And I certainly will never buy a pillow from my pillow guy. But those are my random thoughts for the matter. Now, I gotta close this up because there's something very important I have to do right about now. And that is, I have to make my mortgage payment. So goodbye for now.